Thank you, Nick. Yeah, so it's a exciting day. I'm quite interested in hearing all your views and all the hard research you've done and uh, and then the Q&A. So we'll start. We'll begin with Kate, and we have all of our four speakers online with us right now as well. So Kate, Ashley, Matt, and Samuel. But we'll start with Kate. Kate's research is Canadian Armed Forces activities in the Canadian Arctic, legal and policy considerations, challenges, and ways forward. She is currently working for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, serves as an officer in the Royal Canadian Navy's Primary Reserve, is a fellow at NADSN and Arctic 360, and sits on the editorial board of the Canadian Naval Review, as well as the advisory board of the Canadian Maritime Security Network. Today, she is sharing some of her research she completed last fall as part of her Master's of Public Policy degree at U of T. So Kate, go ahead and present your
Yeah.
research.
Well, thank you so much, Bridget. Here, I'm just gonna set up my slides here. Are you all able to see that? Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Todd, as Bridget said, and today I'll be presenting about legal and policy considerations surrounding Canadian Armed Forces activities in the Arctic. Before I start, I'd like to thank everyone at NADSN for this opportunity, including Nick and Bridget, and I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land each of us is dialing in from today and its history. So my presentation today is based on a paper I wrote last year as part of my Master of Public Policy degree. I'd focused my degree on Arctic defense and development issues and wanted to specifically explore the legal and policy framework that allows the Canadian Armed Forces to operate in the Arctic and how this relates to Indigenous rights. So the goal of my paper was to answer two questions. The first was, when there are national security concerns, is the Government of Canada justified in acting unilaterally to protect its territorial integrity and interests in the Arctic? And the second question is there a way the government can work with Indigenous groups to preserve their rights to self-determination and sovereignty in the Arctic while defending its own? So those questions are a lot to unpack, and I'll start by providing some key background and contextual information. So the Arctic is important to the Canadian state for three main reasons. Territorially, the Canadian Arctic makes up 40% of Canada's landmass. Since 1905, the Government of Canada has claimed state sovereignty over the territory that we now know as the Canadian Arctic, has used its military to project force and assert its claim in the region, and has had exclusive constitutional jurisdiction over the Canadian Arctic and its defense. The Arctic is also important to the Government of Canada for economic reasons. The region is resource-rich and is home to oil, gas, and critical minerals, as well as emerging maritime shipping routes that offer enormous time and cost savings. Since the Cold War, the Canadian Arctic has also been thought of as a strategic military approach to North America. This has prompted the government to invest in the Canadian Armed Forces activities and capabilities to defend their territory and sovereignty in the region. Even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the Canadian Armed Forces have continued to maintain year-round presence in the Arctic to ensure that the Government of Canada can respond to threats through military means. In recent years, military capabilities in the North have become increasingly necessary as as the international security environment and ecological environment in the Arctic have experienced rapid change, prompting Canada, its allies, and adversaries to invest in Arctic defense capabilities and opportunities. To figure out the answers to my research questions, it's also important to look at the historical context of settler-Indigenous relations in the Canadian Arctic. The Canadian Arctic has been home to Indigenous peoples for hundreds of years and continues to be home to over 100,000 Indigenous people today. Settlers only began establishing trading posts, churches, schools, and hospitals in the Arctic and trading with Indigenous peoples there in the 1800s. However, by the 1930s, the Government of Canada had formed and began implementing colonial policies in the Canadian Arctic that had wide-ranging negative impacts on Indigenous peoples there. In recent decades, the Government of Canada has become more aware of the consequences of their colonial policies, has demonstrated a willingness to work towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and has recognized Indigenous rights, including rights to self-determination and self-government. In the Arctic, This has taken the form of the federal government gradually giving control of things like education, housing, health, language, resource management, and social services to the Northern Territories. Despite this progress, the federal government has not changed the way that it utilizes the Canadian Armed Forces to defend Canada's state sovereignty in the Arctic. This leaves us with an apparent contradiction. On one hand, the Government of Canada has openly accepted that Indigenous peoples in the Canadian Arctic should be able to govern themselves, while on the other hand, the government continues to assert its state sovereignty over the Canadian Arctic, most visibly through the Canadian Armed Forces activities. So does the government need to work with Indigenous peoples to defend the Canadian Arctic? Legally speaking, they should. According to Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, as well as the common law, Indigenous peoples have treaty and Aboriginal rights, including a right to their territory, such as the Canadian Arctic, and the right to be consulted when governments do anything that could negatively affect their rights. In addition, Canada's United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act was brought into force in 2021, legislating that Indigenous peoples have a right to self-determination and self-government. These two rights are closely associated with the concept of Indigenous sovereignty. The United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act also calls for Canada to consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples and to obtain free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing measures that may affect them. It specifically bars Canada from authorizing military activities in Indigenous peoples' territories, unless justified by relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by Indigenous peoples that are concerned. The legal recognition of Indigenous rights and sovereignty challenges the foundational idea that the Government of Canada is the sole sovereign authority in the Canadian Arctic. It indicates that there are two sovereign groups that should be included when making decisions pertaining to defense in the Canadian Arctic: the federal government and Indigenous peoples who live there. The Government of Canada has also published policies that feature commitments recognizing both Canada's state sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty. In Canada's 2024 Defence Policy, Our North Strong and Free, and 2019 Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, the government has committed to expanding Canadian Armed Forces presence and investments in the Arctic, collaborating with Indigenous partners and communities to defend Canada's state sovereignty in the region, and prioritizing reconciliation. The Arctic and Northern Policy Framework also explicitly outlines the Government of Canada's goals to advance and uphold rights of Indigenous peoples, including the right to self-determination. In the federal government's 2022 Inuit Nunungat policy, the government reiterates its security and reconciliation priorities. According to this policy, all federal government policies, programs, and services should support Inuit self-determination. However, this policy includes a caveat saying that nothing in it compromises or undermines Canada's commitments to its national security and defense interests. So, it's evident that the government has committed to defending state sovereignty and advancing Indigenous sovereignty. On the surface, these two commitments seem contradictory. However, there is a way the government can meet both of these goals when working to defend its sovereignty in the region. By meaningfully consulting and collaborating with Indigenous peoples, the Government of Canada can work to align its national security and defense interests with those of Indigenous peoples in the North, to ensure that neither defense nor reconciliation is compromised when making decisions that involve military activity in the Arctic. But there are three challenges that the government will face when trying to achieve both its defense and reconciliation goals at once. The first is one I've already spoken about. The federal government's state sovereignty can be seen to conflict with Indigenous sovereignty. That being said, Canada's legal and policy framework leaves room for Indigenous sovereignty to coexist with Canada's state sovereignty if the Government of Canada adequately consults with Indigenous peoples and receives consent for actions that may impact Indigenous rights. The second challenge is that the government is legally required to engage in potentially lengthy consultations with Indigenous groups when making decisions that could affect them. These consultations may hinder the government's ability to make decisions quickly, which is problematic if the government needs to defend the Canadian Arctic from immediate threats. The government should find a way to streamline consultations, allowing for decisions about defending the Arctic to be made quickly while representing Indigenous interests. The third challenge is the existence of constitutional habits. So constitutional habits are patterns of public decision-making that emerge in immediate responses to emergencies. The federal government has a constitutional habit of infringing on and ignoring Indigenous rights when making security and defense decisions, especially in times of emergency. Overcoming this colonial constitutional habit will be difficult, but is necessary in order to achieve reconciliation. If the government wants to continue advancing reconciliation while defending its national security, it must ensure that Canadian Armed Forces activities in the Arctic are conducted with Indigenous peoples' consent. Indigenous communities benefit from Canadian Armed Forces activities and investments in the region, and national security concerns do not push the government into constitutional habits where Indigenous rights are ignored. The government has a well-documented duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples when government actions may infringe on their rights. Under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the government is also required to obtain affected Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent before Canadian Armed Forces activities occur, including in the Arctic. To fulfill this requirement, conversations and consultations with Indigenous leaders in the Arctic about continued and increased military presence in the area are necessary. As the Canadian Armed Forces increases its activities and investments in the region, the Government of Canada should aim to ensure that they are beneficial to both defence aims and Indigenous communities. The government should also practice and prearrange expedited consultation processes in preparation for if and when national security concerns arise in the Arctic. By doing so, they can forge new reconciliatory constitutional habits instead of falling into their old colonial ones. In conclusion, I found that, although the Government of Canada has the constitutional authority to unilaterally authorize Canadian Armed Forces activities in the Arctic, it is obliged by its policies, legislation, and the common law to ensure that such activities are conducted with affected Indigenous peoples' consent, that Indigenous communities benefit from Canadian Armed Forces activities in the region, and that national security concerns do not push governments into colonial constitutional habits where Indigenous peoples' concerns are ignored. By adequately consulting Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, ensuring Indigenous communities benefit from Canadian Armed Forces activities and investments in the region, and practicing and prearranging expedited consultation processes, the Government of Canada can advance reconciliation and uphold Indigenous peoples' rights while defending its national security. So thank you again for this opportunity to share my thoughts with you, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. So here's a link to my email as well as my LinkedIn if you'd like to get in touch. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Such a powerful presentation, very good recommendations as well. So now we'll move on to Matt. Matt's work has been around narrative building, an essential tool in safeguarding the security and sovereignty in the Canadian Arctic. He is an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary. He is majoring in political science with a minor in history. His research primarily focuses on international security and Arctic sovereignty. In addition to his studies, Matt has spent time working for Public Safety Canada, where he worked on policy ranging from financial crime and threat financing to national security. Over to you, Matt.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Let me just set up my screen here. And wrangling is very accurate when it comes to financial crime. There's a lot of wrangling involved there.
Right.
Awesome. And you can see my slides, right? Got a lot of monitors going on here. Okay, perfect. So my presentation is a bit more abstract than like hard actual policy and military in the Arctic. What I'm talking about is narratives. So narratives have been around forever. We go here, my next slide here. Like this quote says, "We dream in narratives, daydream in narratives, remember, anticipate, and hope. All of our life is shaped by how we see the world and how other people view the world and tell us how they view the world." So the study of narratives didn't really take off until the 2010s, when it became a multidisciplinary subject across all the social sciences, and people wanted to figure out, like, is there a way to harness narratives and actually be able to explain them? And so when we think about narratives, we think kind of like a story, something fictional. A lot of what we know about narratives come from literary studies. So like comedy, tragedy, satire, romance, how someone wants to perceive a story and get you to understand the story and feel the same way that they feel when they're writing it. Because it's fairly new, a definition isn't really set in stone yet. It's still very abstract. So Dennison here has one of the better definitions. He says, according to almost all definitions, narratives are selective depictions of a reality across a set of 2 points in time that include one or more causal claims. And that is a very confusing thing. But to break it down, there are 5 key features of what a narrative is. So it has to have universality. So when there's a shared norm and knowledge needed for an argument to be more impactful, you have to be telling people, but they also need to have their own idea of what you mean when you tell people a narrative. And then it has to have structure, helps rationalize debates by letting actors simplify all the inputs of narrative information and counter narratives to create an easy to understand argument. Selectivity is vital as it lets people pick and choose what they want from the world to put into their narrative to make it more compelling and to better serve its purpose. It also has to have drama. A narrative needs to evoke emotional response and be emotionally impactful. And usually they try to boil it down to binary ideas like good versus evil. There's something very easy for people to understand. And also ambiguity too. You don't want to try to lead someone to believe something. You kind of want it to be open-ended so people come to their own conclusions to feel like they came to it on their own versus someone telling them what to believe. And then moving from just a general narrative to narratives in international relations. A lot of this comes from post-structuralism and constructivism, kind of saying that human reality is constructed and a lot of everything that we do is in flux. So people, instead of saying facts, will just kind of use narratives to simplify key concepts, break them down to easier to understand simple arguments, because not everyone that they're trying to pitch to has a PhD in this, researches this subject. It needs to be for the lowest common denominator to understand. So taking these narratives, making it as simple as possible, helps everyone understand key concepts. And for it to be persuasive, there's another 4 fundamental principles. So necessity, which comes from an understanding that the world is growing more complex, interconnected, and unpredictable, leading to political actors to create more narratives, which help simplify the world into more digestible topics. Has to be interest, similar concept of universality, as narratives only work because they align with a consumer's interest. Someone already needs to be kind of thinking that way to believe a narrative. Plausibility, narratives need to be both theoretically and factually accurate. To succeed, narratives must use evidence and events to make outcomes more plausible. And then lastly, imagination in a narrative needs to spark emotion from the consumer, transporting them into the narrative and making it more immediate and personal. Plausibility is where most narratives fall apart, especially in IR. If the claims are too outlandish or just completely made up, it's difficult to persuade people into believing you. And then taking these principles into consideration, there are 3 main types of narratives in IR. You have your descriptive narratives. Narratives develop an idea of time and space in the consumer's mind and describe how a consumer should feel about the given narrative. Then viewpoint narratives used to make the consumer see the exact viewpoint of the narrator, limiting the narrative to one person's view. However, one individual cannot create a narrative by itself. It must come from all levels and be repeated by many sources to give it legitimacy. One person can say one thing once, but as soon as other people in their camp start repeating it, moving it around, then it becomes more realistic in the minds of people. The last kind of narrative is the historical narrative. These narratives rely on evidence and interpretation of historical events, which are then argued as legitimacy for modern day issues. For an actor to maintain their position, they must control the narrative. Narratives are everywhere in daily life, and they range from macro to micro in scope and affect everyone. And the framing narratives is essential for actors, granting them more agency to promote their values and interests. Is usually done by leveraging shared myths among peers. So now that we have a basic concept of what narratives are in a more academic sense, moving on to what narratives are in the Canadian Arctic, we start with Stephen Harper, who really liked to use narratives, especially in the Arctic when he first came to office, as it kind of gave him a focal point of somewhere to focus on during his election campaign. Before he came into power, Canada was big on its narratives of multiculturalism and internationalism. He started shifting that narrative to more economic power and strong sovereignty. So the region of the Arctic was largely ignored until 2005 when Stephen Harper ran on aggressive Arctic policy, claiming here that Canada's new national government understands the first principle of Arctic sovereignty: use it or lose it. This kind of makes people think, like, what is the Arctic region? What should we be doing up there? And through his policies, he brought the Arctic into public discourse to create a narrative that would attempt to redefine Canadian identity. Didn't really work too well, but he definitely tried his best during his time in office. Harper was determined to change the Canadian identity narrative. He wanted a Canada known for strength and security. He took steps to change Canadian symbols, like the national animal from a beaver to a polar bear, and replacing human rights activists with icebreakers in the $50 bill. He was unsuccessful in doing both those things, but kind of says where his head was at when he was creating these narratives. He wanted to change Canada's identity from a diplomatic nation to a nation emphasizing hard security. He used symbols of strength to reinforce his narrative of a strong Canada. By orchestrating this narrative, Harper socially constructed the Arctic as an integral to Canadian society. Once Harper became Prime Minister, hard power narratives dominated Arctic discourse. As he stated in his 2005 election speech, "It's time to act to defend Canadian sovereignty. You do not defend national sovereignty with flags, cheap election rhetoric, and advertising campaigns. You need forces on the ground, ships in the sea, and proper surveillance." Harper's government used history and fear to create a narrative to build its foreign policy. It romanticized all of the military hardships Canada has survived in the past and used that to build an identity of Canadianness. This narrative used facts and histories of 200 years of continued Canadian occupation of its high north to justify more spending in the high north and proving that it is Canadian territory. The Harper government used the threat narrative extensively as it overemphasized the threat of foreign actors in the Arctic. He maintained this narrative by saying, "With foreign aircraft probing the skies, vessels plying northern waters, and the eyes of the world gazing our way, we must remain vigilant." The Harper government also maintained this narrative by publicly acknowledging when Russian bombers traveled near Canadian airspace in 2009. He used this as a way to keep the threat of Russia in the minds of all Canadians, while highlighting that they still pose a threat to Canada and they will attack through the Arctic. Harper also used narrative symbolism to enhance Canadian sovereignty claims to the North Pole. During his time as Prime Minister, Harper made Santa Claus an official Canadian citizen of Canada, which was reaffirmed in 2010 as Immigration Minister Jason Kenney said, "As a Canadian citizen living in Canada's north, Santa can re-enter Canada freely once his trip around the world is complete." The government continues to invest in measures that exercises Canada's sovereignty and creates more economic opportunities in the north. We want to ensure that Santa and all northern people benefit from considerable progress that has been made. The rationale behind this narrative is that it technically puts a Canadian resident at the North Pole, justifying a sovereignty claim. This was in response to a very real subject of the continental shelf argument, saying how far Canada's continental shelf actually goes. That is a real argument, but then he just put Santa at the top and said that we own it because Santa's Canadian, which helps people that don't really understand the debate of the continental shelf feel more connected to the region, because it feels that you belong to the same country as Santa, giving a sense of pride and connected to the Arctic. And then with Justin Trudeau, he also continued on with the Santa narrative. More of a publicity stunt, but it kind of is a tradition now with the governments to keep going with it. So in 2018, he reaffirmed this narrative by reproducing it across the federal government. The Canadian Revenue Agency claimed that they had income tax records on the clauses. Canada Post confirmed that Santa would be returning to a Canadian address at the North Pole. Transport Canada claimed that Santa was clear for takeoff, and most notably, one of the spokespeople said that the couple are always dressed in patriotic colors and that the clauses embody the compassionate, giving spirit of what it means to be Canadian. Starting in 2015, Trudeau shifted away from a narrative of hard security to a soft security approach, focusing on human security. This approach still uses symbolism like Harper, because at the time, Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland emphasized lines from the Canadian national anthem saying "True North, strong and free." These lyrics reinforce the identity narrative that all Canadians are Northern people and the Arctic is intrinsically Canadian. Trudeau also continued to use historical claims like Harper, saying there's a collective heritage and that Canada's high north is shared responsibility of all Canadians. Trudeau does depart from Harper's narrative in a critical way, though. Since 2015, Trudeau has worked to improve relations with Northern Indigenous people in a new narrative to gain support from Indigenous communities. Trudeau stresses reconciliation and continues to apologize for colonial treatment that these groups endured throughout history. In his Arctic and Northern policy framework, He emphasizes that there's a disconnect between the government and the Northern Indigenous people, and claims that this policy was jointly developed between the two groups to understand issues of the North and to help fix them. This narrative brings Indigenous people into the fold and claims that Indigenous identity is a part of a shared Canadian identity, because he realizes that the Indigenous populations in the North need to feel that they are Canadian and not that their own group up there, because that is our only legitimate claim to the North, is that we have a population that lives up there. But if they don't feel Canadian, then our legitimacy kind of falls apart. Under Trudeau, a new stewardship narrative departs from Harper's isolationist narrative, as Trudeau is willing to be more of a cooperative leader in the region, working towards a common goal. Canadian Arctic messaging then switches to a focus on patriotism, cooperation, and leadership. Canada uses a narrative positioning itself as a global leader in the Arctic and a responsible steward to be the guardian of the delicate ecosystem. This narrative highlights its leadership role in the region, founding in the Arctic Council, leading many important research initiatives, and leading to reduce the impact of climate change. This narrative ensures that other states, especially non-Arctic states, do not come into the region and challenge Canadian sovereignty. Moving away from politicians and moving more towards the military and the community in the North, the politicians have moved to more of a soft security approach. However, naturally, the military has continued with a threat narrative and more focus on hard security. However, there is a diverging narrative in the region. So one is based on the domestic scale and the other is more international. Domestically, military interest in the region cannot be sustained without a threat narrative. They need people to believe there is an immediate threat to Canadians if Arctic defense is not properly funded. To reproduce this narrative, NORAD Commander General Terence O'Shaughnessy used a threat narrative to justify the need for more military resources. He says the Arctic is no longer a fortress wall. Russia has left us with no choice but to improve our homeland defense, capability, and capacity. And then very recently, just the last couple of days, in an effort to persuade the federal government to invest more in Arctic infrastructure, the Premier of Northwest Territories and the Mayor of Inuvik called on the feds to justify Arctic infrastructure development as national defense spending to go towards NATO spending targets. However, to be more convincing and to play on emotion, Inuvik's mayor said, "It's time for the Canadian government to get off his behind and get serious about defense spending before we all have to learn Russian." Now, this narrative lacks some logic, because it's very unlikely that the Russians are going to come over the Nordic Sea or the North Sea, invade us, take over our land, and make us speak Russian. But it does do a good job of playing on the emotions of a consumer. It reminds them of historical tensions with Russians in the North during the Cold War. And this demonstrates that narratives can sometimes be less about truth and more about igniting emotional response to justify real policy development in the region. However, this is where things divide, because domestically, Canadian military needs people to believe there is a threat there if they're going to be able to build the bases they want, develop the infrastructure they need in the region. But also, at the same time, we don't want people coming to the Arctic and invading and putting their own stakes here. So internationally, we have the Canadian Chief of Defense Staff, both the most recent ones, saying very clearly that if someone were to come invade the Canadian Arctic, my first task would be to rescue them. And then just a couple weeks ago, Wayne Erie, when he was being interviewed by a Bloomberg journalist, said that if we were being invaded, the first capability we would send up is search and rescue. So if someone came over with their ships to invade Canada, instead of matching them, we would just send search and rescue because they'd probably end up crashing. This is more justified too in Canada's Arctic policy, when it says, while Canada sees no immediate threat to the Arctic in the north, as Arctic becomes more accessible, continued security and defense of the Canadian Arctic requires effective security and security frameworks. So we know that we need to work on investment, but we're also not genuinely concerned about immediate threat to our security in the region, hard security at least. So what? We've been over narratives, and we've seen how people can kind of just say whatever they want, whether it's truthful or not, but to help get policy going in their favor. So why does narratives matter to the region? Well, first, it helps shape a northern identity. Canada is one of the larger Arctic states and has 40% of its territory in the Arctic. However, only 1% of the population actually lives there. With a sparse and desperate population throughout the Arctic, the region is difficult to govern adequately, and building support is very difficult. Canada uses symbols of polar bears, winter ice, and polar explorers, winter ice, polar bears, and Inukshuks to build a narrative that makes the average Canadian identify with the Arctic. since realistically, most Canadians will never actually step foot in the Arctic, let alone the Arctic Circle. Canada also uses historical ties to the region to reproduce this narrative that Canada has always been a northern country. The sovereignty narrative remains strong and leads to public outcry when ships not authorized to go through the Northwest Passage come about, or balloons come over the top. Canada continues to use historical heritage narratives to project Arctic sovereignty, primarily through leveraging the Indigenous people in the North, defining them as strong, thriving Indigenous population who have survived for thousands of years in the region. That's why it's so important for politicians to build strong relations with them and make them feel like they are a part of the country, because we rely on them to prove that we have Arctic sovereignty. Another reason why it matters, or narratives matter in the region, is for dissuading adversaries. As Canadian adversaries continue to challenge a hegemonic world order, hegemonic world order narrative, Canada's role in the world is less defined as it once was, and the rules-based international system Canada helped create has become strained. This lets emerging states influence regions they previously could not, like the Arctic. As Canada emphasizes, people have lived in the high north well before it was of interest to anyone else, signaling that non-Arctic states should respect Canada's Arctic authority. It is willing to cooperate with non-Arctic states on investment, research, and climate change issues, however believes resource management and regional governance to remain in the hands of Arctic countries. Canada also uses its military to project its presence in the Arctic and project its sovereignty. This narrative that the Arctic is defended is done through primarily through symbolic exercises, small bases, and observability. This narrative was made clear by Chief Warrant Officer Pierre Ouellet, who brought up Bloomberg journalists up to the Arctic to show them around. And they were asked, why are you guys wearing green camouflage if you're in the Arctic? Shouldn't you be wearing your white camouflage? That's when he responded, we want to be seen, which is an interesting take for a military. They are not trying to pretend that they're not there. They're hoping that other people are looking at them, so they know that the forces are actually there and able to fight there. And then justifying regional investment. This is probably the most critical reason for narratives in the region, especially domestically. Canada is already struggling with many different issues, which needs significant funding to resolve. The Arctic is easy for politicians to ignore when there are other issues to focus on, which rewards them with greater political capital. Narratives aim to connect Canadians to the Arctic in a way where funding and development can widely be supported and justified. It is very politically risky for one politician in Toronto to want to put all of their resources into the Arctic when Toronto already has a lot of issues. But if they're able to build an actual narrative that's believable, plausible, makes sense, why the area should be funded, then people are going to be more willing to let money be sent to the Arctic rather than spent on themselves. And then this one's more abstract, but something that's going to be very relevant for the next couple of years is countering the threat of cognitive warfare. Canada is not immune to this. Many democracies are going to be under threat for this going forward. But it's the idea that countries are realizing they no longer need to fire bullets to win a war. Instead, they're playing with our open society, our free speech, our social media to embed their own narratives in there and draw people away from pragmatic thinking into their own camps. Especially through social media, algorithms, people aren't getting their news from reliable sources. They're more trusting people that tell the truth online. And when you have countries purposely putting fake things online, the truth gets very, very blurred. A great quote from Lockenbauer on this is adversaries are discerning new opportunities to attack Canada's vulnerabilities and contest our narratives at all levels. Weaponizing information operations to sow confusion and discord, creating ambiguity about intent, and preserving deniability. This is going to be a threat going forward, as our open system is going to be pretty torn if we don't find a way to counter these narratives, because our adversaries are realizing that the rules-based system no longer is beneficial for them, and so they're actively acting against it. They realize they're strong enough, powerful enough, have the influence that they no longer need a hegemonic world order. They prefer a multipolar world, a bipolar world, but they don't have the strength to fight for it, so they're using these ways of undermining our democracies and ripping the fabric apart to create the society that they want. And then lastly, controlling the narrative going forward. Canadian external narratives are defined by two topics, sovereignty and security. Security and sovereignty are separate. Security is about continental defense, while sovereignty is more of a nationalistic narrative, making Canadians believe that the Arctic is Canadian, so then that we can work to protect it. Canada's rule-based system is under threat. Its physical borders may be safe from direct military action, but its democratic institutions and resource control are under constant attack, with other countries trying to meddle in our political relations and also just buying up resources where they can. It's moving more from a national defense issue, more of a national security issue, as we need to be mindful of who owns our resources in the North and if it should be Canadian or if it should be in other countries. I think Canada must continue to push its current Arctic narratives to justify much needed development in the region to both improve the lives of people living there and improving defense and resource security as the world continues to thaw and Canada's high north becomes an even more attractive target. Okay, I believe I am well over my time. I apologize for that, but that is my presentation. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak here. And I will stop sharing my screen.
I think you're on mute, Bridget.
I don't like this mute button. I hit it and then it just automatically goes back. But thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Excellent narratives to consider. So now we'll move on to Ashley. Her research is a comparison of the Canadian Rangers with the Canadian Army's primary reserve force. She is a research fellow at NADSN, a policy analyst with the Government of Canada, and is 1 week away from completing her MA, so she's probably done by now, in political studies at the University of Manitoba. So take it away, Ashley.
Thank you. And yes, I had written that, assuming the timeline will work up, so it will be still a week today that I will be defending. So thank you, everyone. My name is Ashley Holden, and as mentioned, the research I chose to present today is my MA thesis entitled A Comparison of the Canadian Rangers with the Canadian Army's Primary Reserve Force. And can everyone see the slides? Okay, perfect. So while the primary Army Reserves and the Canadian Rangers both fall under the large umbrella that is the Army Reserves, they have some important distinctions. So this thesis asks, why does the Government of Canada have separate Army Reserve systems with differing internal and external characteristics? What are the differences and similarities between the two systems, and what are the lessons learned? So these are the questions that this thesis examines to glean policy-informed advice for the CAF, Government of Canada, and allies who may be looking to implement a similar program. The main basis for comparison consists of an examination of internal and external characteristics for each group. So the internal factors compared include leadership, rank structure, and typical tasks, guiding documents for discipline and military professionalism, training plans, command and control structures, and combat capabilities. And the external characteristics compared include each group's geographical location, recruitment demographics, and different ways of knowing. It is hypothesized that the most important variables of distinction are the external characteristics, given that the internal characteristics apply to the Canadian Army Service, of which the two groups are members. Nevertheless, there are important internal distinctions as well. So just for the sake of time, I won't summarize the history of each group's formations, but evidently the Rangers program was established in 1947 to provide a CAF presence in remote and northern areas of Canada. And the primary reserve units, formerly known as the militia, were established in 1855 to augment the regular forces. For decades, both groups have gone through many mandate changes, as well as many different budget cuts, but today their roles and responsibilities do overlap, and they're ultimately meant to provide military presence, being the Rangers, and augment the regular forces, meaning the primary reserves. So the internal characteristics, the first being leadership, rank structure, and typical tasks. Enlisting in Canada's reserve forces is entirely voluntary. Reservists devote their spare time to military service, and they provide already learned civilian skills to their military roles. The primary domestic missions of the Canadian Army Reserves are to assist other government departments or provincial governments in responding to natural disasters, support search and rescue or SAR missions, and provide security at special events. If called to serve abroad, individual personnel are selected on a voluntary basis and often for their particular skill set that is often connected to their other civilian jobs when not serving in the CAF. The Rangers, in contrast, are strictly Army and are all part-time. The Rangers are based in remote, isolated, and coastal regions of Canada, and they provide a CAF presence in areas that cannot conveniently or economically be covered by the primary reserve force or regular force. The Rangers' duties include assisting in SAR missions, supporting natural disaster relief, performing sovereignty or national security duties, reporting any unusual or suspicious activities, conducting patrols, and collecting local data for the CAF. The Canadian Rangers prove particularly important when conducting search and rescue, as the communities require their support given the lack of other personnel apart from the RCMP and agencies to assist in these missions. So similar to regular force members, Army Reservist training requires that members undergo basic military qualification training, which takes place over 4 weeks. And Army Reservists are paid for every day that they work, and there are also automatic wage increases for every year of service, amongst other benefits. Alternatively, the Rangers are provided some basic training by the CAF and very limited supplies and funding. Rangers also utilize local and Indigenous knowledge, as well as practiced outdoor skills in order to fulfill their tasks and responsibilities. Upon enrollment, Rangers are considered trained based on the guarantee that they are equipped and knowledgeable enough to survive and operate on the land. They are well acquainted with their local community members, terrain, and weather conditions. And according to the Government of Canada, Rangers are paid a maximum of up to 12 days compensation per year. Now, a key difference between the Rangers and primary reserves is the latter's capability to conduct combat operations. The Rangers are not combat capable and will not use force against soldiers or citizens. Now, next up is the external characteristics. So the primary Army Reserves and Rangers are found all across Canada. And as you can see from both of these figures, it sort of provides a layout of where all of the units are located. So evidently most reserve units are located in more southern areas of Canada and are more concentrated in Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The regular forces are distributed similarly to the reserves, and the Rangers are dispersed widely across Canada, but are primarily in remote northern areas. Currently, Indigenous representation in the CAF, not including the Canadian Rangers, is at 2.7%, with the goal of growing to 3.5% by 2026. Visible minorities in the CAF, excluding Indigenous members, represents 9.4% of the CAF population, despite the 22.3% total minority population in Canada. And as of 2022, within the primary reserves, 11.3% identify as visible minorities and 2.6% are Indigenous. Now, as of August 2023, the Department of National Defence estimates that out of 5,000 members, approximately 26% of the Canadian Rangers self-identify as Indigenous. However, when drawing upon Dr. Lackenbauer's numerous publications, it is believed that this statistic is highly distorted, and the methodology that was used by DND and the CAF was not adequate. And Canadian Army Headquarters suggests that only 25.6% of Rangers in one CRPG, being the 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, completed a CAF cultural self-identification survey, with only 19.8% of respondents self-identifying as Indigenous. Now, due to the difference in demographics between the Rangers and the primary Army Reserves, there are cultural aspects that inevitably will vary in each group. The Rangers are not officially labeled an Indigenous program, but rather a subcomponent of the reserves that leverages and utilizes the unique skill sets of Canadians from diverse social and ethnic backgrounds in support of domestic sovereignty and public safety. Indigenous and local knowledge are often thought of as the alternative to Western science, but in fact, they all represent different ways of knowing which are complementary. Now, Indigenous knowledge is place or environment specific in terms of its applicability to everyday lives, and therefore the Rangers do not follow one set of rules or plans for conducting patrols. Their CRPGs have various ways of completing tasks and operations, often informed by Indigenous knowledge depending on where they live. The primary Army Reserve culture typically reflects that of the regular forces, largely guided by Western knowledge systems. They have hierarchical authority structures and decision-making processes. Both the Canadian Rangers and primary Army Reserves also utilize local knowledge in their respective communities. Local knowledge is defined as knowledge with respect to a local context or setting, including knowledge of specific characteristics, circumstances, events, and relationships. So there are several conclusions one can draw. Both groups are extensions of the regular forces, but much less costly to DND due to the part-time nature of their roles and limits to their training programs, equipment, and scope of duties. The Government of Canada, however, should acknowledge the unfair pay arrangements for rangers who are required to be on duty at a moment's notice whenever there are emergencies, but are not compensated for that level of emergency readiness. And requests for federal assistance of the CAF and search and rescue missions have become more frequent, especially as a result of human-made disasters related to climate change. And while in southern Canada, the CAF is deemed to be the last resort when requesting assistance, the Rangers remain the first organization to respond alongside RCMP in northern Canada. Without their assistance, it is likely that these remote and northern communities would be extremely challenged to respond to calls for help. The Government of Canada should especially feel incentivized to maintain the Rangers in particular due to the reconciliatory nature that the program signifies to the rest of Canada and its Indigenous populations. The Rangers program has created an opportunity for Indigenous communities to have a voice at the federal level in regard to issues of sovereignty and created opportunity towards further autonomy and self-determination from a community standpoint. Ultimately, both primary Army Reserve units and Canadian Ranger Patrol groups need to exist separately. While there have been calls to replicate the Rangers model in large urban centers in southern Canada, these southern communities would likely lack an important cultural element of remote communities. Reliance on others, resilience given remote locations, and often extreme weather are all features of remote communities, not urban ones. And given that the primary reserves are trained very differently, their current expertise would not prove fit for purpose in Canada's Arctic and remote areas. Given that the Rangers serve as terrain guides when Southern CAF units visit their communities, it is clear that primary reserves would require different training should this model be transferred to remote locations. Ultimately, the tasks and responsibilities of the Rangers and Army Reserves are unique because their environments call for it. So when considering the impact of differentiating internal and external characteristics on both groups, the external characteristics carry greater implications as they cannot be changed or controlled. The demographics of both groups will continue to reflect the communities from which they are recruited, and knowing the communities intimately is a strength of the Reserves and Rangers. Their ways of knowing are not transposable either, and both groups' unique use of different types of knowledges are necessary to complete their responsibilities. All of these external characteristics have an impact on the internal characteristics as they influence the decisions made internally, which has led to their particular rank structure, training, roles, and responsibilities. So the Rangers model could prove promising to Canadian allies with Indigenous populations. The Rangers program is a way for Southern populations to learn from Indigenous populations, which is key to engendering respect, trust, and understanding. Scholars have placed emphasis on climate change and the growing geostrategic competition occurring in the Arctic. As a result, governments are being called upon to increase capabilities in the Arctic to provide security and defense while collaborating with the communities that live in these northern areas. It is believed that the Rangers represent a successful model that could be either replicated or used as inspiration for other allies when exploring options with their Indigenous populations in their own Arctic landscapes. Applying the Rangers model in other Arctic countries may strengthen political relationships between states and Indigenous nations. So in conclusion, the primary Army Reserves and Canadian Rangers are two distinct and important groups vital to ensuring the safety and security of Canadians in their communities. Despite both groups being categorized as Army Reserves, they were each created to serve different purposes and continue to hold overlapping but unique responsibilities with very different skills and capabilities. Understanding the differences and similarities of each group was key to determining any policy gaps or necessary amendments required to ensuring these CAF groups maintain their usefulness. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And thanks for bringing more attention to the Rangers in the Arctic. And I liked when you mentioned the gendering of the Rangers as well. So Q&A is after the presentations. Okay, so we'll move on to Samuel Pallaq Huyer now, Indigenous Arctic Sovereignty and Security, Indigenous Knowledge and Teachings for a More Secure Arctic. He is a Netsilik Inuk from Johaven, Nunavut, attending his final undergrad year at Trent University, studying Indigenous Studies. with an emphasis on Indigenous Arctic security and sovereignty. He's a Canadian Armed Forces veteran for over 8 years, thank you, who specialized in advanced Arctic winter warfare with 4 Engineer Support Regiment, CFB Gagetown. Now a research fellow with NADSIN, Sam's background includes the exploration of precious minerals of Nunavut and his latest collaboration work with Common Good Solutions, Youth Crisis Intervention, and Homelessness Prevention Initiative research. Sam's knowledge of Indigenous Inuit culture and lived experience provides insight and possibilities for a more secure and sovereign Arctic for Inuks and the territory of Nunavut. Welcome, Sam, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, everyone. See if this works here. Everybody see this? Perfect. Does that work for everybody? Can you see it? Amazing. All right. So my name is Sam. I'm a Netslik Inuit, as Bridget said, and I'm going to be talking obviously about Indigenous Arctic sovereignty and security. So to begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm coming from the territory of the Anishinaabe people here in Peterborough, Ontario, and acknowledge that I do not speak upon all Indigenous people of the Arctic, but not even just my own community, but I'm just a researcher and an Inuk scholar to address the sovereignty and security issues that may be falling between the gaps within our academics' perspectives. So to begin with, I'd like to say that the Arctic is being one of the most affected parts of the globe of climate change. And as you see here, it's drastically increasing almost two times faster than anywhere else in the world, which affects the fresh water, the land, the ocean, the sea ice, and Indigenous communities who rely on the sea ice and the land for its resources, natural resources, its food systems, and its livability. One of the main components that I want to emphasize here is that because of climate change, most scholars and people say, well, okay, well, how does this impact me? Really, it impacts Indigenous people first, as they are 80% of the population in Nunavut and about a vast majority of the population in Northwest Territories and as well as the Yukon in the Gwich'in area. And so what I want to emphasize too today is that the main reason why I'm talking about our security is more on climate change and how it affects Indigenous peoples and the ability to adapt to a new climate that's ongoing. First, let's make an acknowledgement. We like to see whose Arctic is it, and Canada likes to say, "Oh, it's our Arctic," but I see Canada as seeing it as its cottage. It's rarely there. So when we talk about Indigenous Arctic knowledge, we talk about the utilization and maintain knowledge since time immemorial. So even before Canada was formed, and how it is more of a temporal and place-based knowledge, and even the language structure that Inuit and other Indigenous people in the Arctic utilize is more verb-based rather than noun-based. Our idea and our perspectives is that we live with the land, not on it or profit off it. And so that educative knowledge is really integral to understanding how Indigenous people in the Arctic maintain their sovereignty and their security through their language programs, orality, and their new writing systems of using syllabics, and understanding how the kinship-based relationship with all beings in the Arctic is integral. So we're not just talking about the animals and the water and everything else. It also means everything that's around us, everything that is encompassed about who our identity is as Indigenous Arctic people. Holistically and traditional with non-colonial knowledge of Northern peoples is integral to understanding how the Arctic works. And unless you live in the Arctic for a period of time and have experienced the Arctic through the entire season, it's very difficult to get a full comprehensive ideology on how the Arctic works. Through an Indigenous lens, Indigenous people live there year round. They understand and have the knowledge base to create a good understanding to help not just Canadians and the military members in the Arctic to survive in the land, but to how to thrive and how to flourish. Because we hear from a lot of Canadian scholars saying, "Oh, it's a harsh environment." But like, to me and to other Indigenous people, yes, it may be harsh to you, but to us, we thrive in it. This is our lands, our territory. This is who we are since time immemorial. And I want to emphasize that when Canadians come up, they are also guests. And when Canadians are on Indigenous territory, they are guests on the lands and territory that they are currently reside on. So I want to emphasize that is my main point. Moving on to that, we see that the modern treaty acknowledgements are very integral to Arctic security and sovereignty relationships with the Canadian Armed Forces and with the Canadian government. I want to emphasize that the implementing UNDRIP TRC's 94 calls to actions are important. However, the main component that I've come across in my studies is that Canadians don't really know the difference between how First Nation Indian Act rights differ from Inuit beneficiary rights. Inuit people are not under the Indian Act and therefore are not under the First Nation rights, and we have different rights because we benefit and we have beneficiary agreements through our laws and through our governance systems in the government of Nunavut. The exceptions would be Gwich'in people who are First Nation, and with Métis people who are in the northern Tejo region of Nunavut, or sorry, correction, Northwest Territories, who have these rights under the quote unquote Indian Act. This also does not make us different, but it also shows us that we have different governing structures and are different governing people. So like I said, I can't talk on all Indigenous people of the Arctic, but rather just my community who are part of the Nunavut settlement area or the Kudikmiyut area, particularly which is famous for the Northwest Passage, and want to emphasize that we are Indigenous people, but we are separate from other Indigenous communities as we are our own identifying and governing structures. This includes our language retention and revitalization programs. Not every language is spoken at the same rate as any other Indigenous communities in the Arctic. I know that Nunavut has one of the highest Indigenous language programs in Canada, being that 80% of the communities speak Inuktitut, where some communities in the Arctic only have a small percentage that speak their Indigenous language. This also includes their cultural retention and expansion for new and a more secure Arctic, which includes their rights to uphold their Indigenous rights and sovereign rights. And like I said before, the identifying fact of distinguishing First Nation rights and beneficiary rights have to be emphasized, because sometimes they can be mixed in when really they're not at all like that. So the adaptation of ongoing climate change is also integral to that language program, to understanding ourselves and to how we represent ourselves in our communities, outside of our communities, within as Canadian citizens, and how we adapt to new challenges such as Arctic infrastructure improvements for affordable housing, clean, accessible water, improved infrastructure builds of both aircraft and marine transportations, not just in the military, but in a community sense. That has to be maintained a lot, and because of severe weather changes. And so that can be very costly on the economy and the community that lives there, because sometimes they aren't able to get the amount of funding they need to maintain that. An additional challenge is also healthcare and education and economic development as the season changes. We see a lot of tourists come in the summertime, but not so much in the wintertime. So that could be very detrimental to how communities thrive. And I want to also emphasize that these factors are very minimal. They only cover a little bit. There's much larger proportions, like even the LGBTQ community in the Arctic isn't really well funded. Violence against Indigenous women is also not really addressed in the Arctic policy framework. It's mentioned, but it's not really in depth of what can be done. And so that needs to be an improvement on what can happen as well, because as Indigenous people, we see two-spirited people and LGBTQ plus community people as being a part of the community, not as being something separate. And this idea of the colonialism saying there's only two genders is technically, in my view, incorrect. And what I want to emphasize as well is that these ideas and these ways of knowing have always been known, and because of colonialism, it's now coming back to communities are being self-taught again, and those need to be protected at all costs through our sovereignty and our security in the Arctic. When it comes to Indigenous Arctic security, I'm very glad you brought up the Canadian Rangers. I used to work with the Canadian Rangers when I was with 4USR engaged in New Brunswick. Since I, was a advanced Arctic winter warfare participant, we trained with a lot of international NATO members. That is also we trained with the Canadian Rangers. They were our guides. They were the ones that knew everything. So when we need to know something, we need to know where to go, where to take our transportation, where to travel, where during what time of season, we always rely on the rangers. So utilizing the Canadian Rangers for search and rescue is also integral, especially when it comes to community. Depending on the season, you don't need a lot of search and rescue in the summertime because everyone's out on the land, everyone's with community, with their the people with family. Usually around the winter time, that's when it gets a little scary when they're out hunting and when they're out gathering their and practicing their Indigenous rights to harvest country food. So that's where we see a lot of the rangers being implemented in search and rescue and emergency management systems, especially during COVID. They're integral into creating a secure system for the communities for people coming in and out of community, as well as having medical practitioners and other people come to the community so that they could receive the medical treatment and what they needed during that time of crisis. What we don't really talk about in the military or with the Canadian Forces, as well as the reliance on Indigenous hunters and fisher people, who both can be very integral to intelligence gathering when they're out on the land and they see like a ship that they don't recognize, or they see a plane that they don't recognize. They could be used to, gather information on what's going on. Since, the Arctic is the Inuit people and Indigenous people of the Arctic are the eyes, ears, and mouths of the Arctic. And it's really integral to use that that method of intelligence as a form of creating a more secure Arctic through an Indigenous traditional lens. This is also enclosed with enhancing and understanding Indigenous languages. And I keep saying Indigenous languages because they are really at a threat. And we don't use Indigenous languages, we miss out on opportunities of knowing intelligence base, and not just about vessels or about aircraft. We also see how Indigenous languages utilize the land and how it's changing. And in Uktutu, there's over 30 different ways to identify snow. And with that language, dying off and or not being utilized as to its best capabilities, the Canadian Armed Forces and Canadian government is missing out on scientific data that Indigenous people have known for over a millennia, which includes Inuktitut, Gwech'in, Dene, and I forgot to put in another one, but it's Inuvi Aluit, and it's and also this language structure isn't really based on a noun based of what it looks like. It's how it is. Indigenous languages use that verb based language to show how the snow is or how the waters are. And another great way we see this isn't through social media. I don't know if anybody of but in the Arctic, Facebook is everything. Everybody communicates through Facebook. It's whether it's like family drama or you're going out hunting, it's Facebook, and social media is really the biggest communicator in the Arctic when it comes to trying to figure out where people are going, what's going on in the community, what is happening on the land or on the territory that's being there. And that's one of the biggest, I would say, one of the security measures that the Canadian government needs to understand is that social media is a huge integral part of showing intelligence on both sides, both to our adversaries and to our Canadian governance, showing that and reporting any suspicious activity or saying what's happening from community to community. So what does this all mean? The Arctic sovereignty and security potential threats and adaptation for the ongoing Arctic climate, military presence, and international interest is increasing. We're seeing more and more ships come to community, more and more tourists come to community. We're seeing more and more activity of military presence being monitored and being implemented because of the sea ice melting at accelerating rates. This creates new northern sea routes for exploration and resource potential. I myself used to be a junior geologist working for a exploration gold mining company, and sometimes they are implemented to hire Indigenous people, but at that same time, Indigenous people are also trying to do 4 or 5 jobs at once. It's an integral part of community networking and part of the way of living in the Arctic. So when we do all these jobs, sometimes we miss something, but sometimes we're able to reiterate what our needs and wants are through the different kind of networking we do. And with that, when we have these new military presence and new shipping routes, the biggest things are how they affect local food disturbances, such as like caribou herds, muskox herds, whales. When there's sonar, Arctic char, we could tell how when the spawning is because of the water's warm or not, seals and ptarmigan. And through this Arctic climate change, we're also seeing the infrastructure damage to airstrips, shipping ports, roadway systems, and more natural disasters that are integral to new security measurements for emergency management, like permafrost destruction, infrastructure, forest fires, tundra fires, and severe seasonal storms. So what does Canada have to do with this? Well, during its Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, it is said that it supports jurisdictional and institutional landscape created by devolution, monetary treaties, land claims, and self-government agreements. What they're pretty much saying is, yes, we recognize that you're your own sovereign government. We also want a piece of the pie. To also provide a forum for all partners to be regularly convene and collaborate decisions on implementation of framework. That's great, but I don't know of how many Indigenous people were added onto this Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. So that needs to be implemented and more looked upon. And I want to emphasize that it's at its core, it has to reflect the authorities and power of territorial, provincial, and Indigenous governments. And this is from the Arctic conclusions of the Arctic Northern Policy Framework that the government of Canada published. So finally, I know my time's out, but I just want to say Nokamik, Marcy, Miigwech, thank you. If you have any information about Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages, that could be you can find them on this website. It's nativeland.ca. It's great. It shows that all these Indigenous territories, land, and languages don't intersect like normal colonial borders. They intertwine, and it's a really great resource to learn more about Indigenous sovereignty of the Arctic and of security. So, Miigwech, thank you.